Okay, so before we start talking about what Rebecca Mason said, did you know what she meant when she was talking about like natural and social kinds, or is that like different terminology for you? You've heard of the term like social constructs, right? Like thinking that's kind of what she was hitting at, but we'll get there. All right. Let's see. A lot of this is going to be like philosophy of science, sort of. Definitely social sciences. So this is almost what they would call like social or cognitive ontology, right? We'll talk about that in a second, exactly what that means. All right. Does anybody remember what ontology is? What's ontology?
Isn't all the creations are made by God?
Okay, well that's part of it. They're all made by God, but it's just a study of what? Do you remember what ontology is? The study of what? Being. You got that? Okay. So it's the what it is question, right? So it's really the one that we sometimes sidestep. You know, we can get in all kinds of discussions about, you know, sovereignty and bodily autonomy and rights and this and that, but this starts with what is it? And that usually stops us because it gives us pause and it gives us an understanding, at least it forces us into an understanding of what exactly we're even talking about. Now, a lot of the problems that we have, and this is why I think it's going to be good for us to talk about the Hand Over the Hills, or whatever that podcast is called, on Friday. So much of what we discuss in our lives and in our social sphere, it's just because we have such poor language skills. And by that I mean, not that we can't talk well, it's that we don't always know exactly what the meaning of the terms we use are. So even today, we're going to use terms like natural and social and real. And we're like, what exactly do those mean? And I know, like, it gets frustrating sometimes. Like, especially if you're trained, like in Aristotelian logic, and you're used to understanding terms well, I can have like an hour discussion with somebody. Sometimes the first 15 minutes are just clearing up terms. Remember, I even kind of kidded with you guys saying, like, if somebody's trying to like come at me and say, well, can you prove God exists? Okay, not even if I don't even really care about proving him, I have two big questions. What exactly do you mean by God? You know, because that's not like a term that we all think the same thing of. And even if we do determine that this is the type of God that we're talking about, now what counts as proof? You know, so do you see, like, even in a term like that, prove God exists, it's almost like you're assuming that somebody absolutely knows what those terms are. And we don't ever get to that point. So that's almost like, what is it? What are we talking about? We talk about, like, what is God? We can talk about the ontology of God. What is a human person? What is water? What is, what is a chicken? And just pick anything. We start talking about what that thing is, it at least helps us clarify so that, remember the terms, we want them to be unambiguous, we want them to be clear, and we also want to make sure they're not vague. So those things help. So part of that's going to be the discussion here today. So first off, so before we start talking exactly how Mason addressed this, let's not even worry about her at this point. There are things that we would call natural, and there are things that we would call social kinds, okay? But now, what do you think is meant by natural? Like, what would be a natural kind? Anybody?
Existing reality, like pure without, like, we didn't create it, like humans did not create it.
Okay, that's part of it, yeah, absolutely.
Like, I remember when he said, like, he was talking about, I think it was, like, an element or something, like a chemical compound.
Yeah.
Like, this is, like made by humans, but it has, like, natural properties. It's made of natural stuff.
Yeah, so we'll have to kind of like make sure we understand, like, we'll talk about the term real too, what that means. Katie, do you have something?
I was going to say physical things.
Okay, yeah, physical things. Anybody else? Yeah, time would be one too. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. I mean, I'm just throwing it out there. I think you used the term water. Lithium was the term that she had in there also. Tigers. But, like you said, Teflon would not be something that you'd find in nature, but you would find the elements to make Teflon in nature. but perhaps even like an alloy, like bronze or such, right? We'd still call that to be natural. So these aren't things necessarily just created by the supernatural. I think, she also made that point. Now look, a side note in all of this is that you can go into a search engine and type in social sciences, natural kinds, and you're going to get 6 different impressions of what exactly it is. So there's never just like, this is what we're talking about. We're going to settle on, this being the things that we're calling natural kinds. Other people are going to argue. Plus, you're going to see her argue that social kinds have a lot of the properties of a natural kind too. So with the natural kinds, we're talking about like, what's its causal relation, or is it like, how did he get here? Like, what caused this thing to become? So it can't be limited to just stuff we find in nature. But, because we can manipulate stuff like Teflon and bronze and such. But it's also going to be things that, like time, that aren't necessarily something that, it's mind independent, but it might only be like relative from our perspective, right? I mean, you'd have to make an argument, is time relevant to a tiger? I mean, it's unlikely a tiger thinks twice about it, right? Or how would they? Or if they do, what words would they, how would they understand it? They might understand change, but they wouldn't understand change in the same way that we would, if they put some sort of value to it and call it time. So anyway, lithium, tiger, water, I think was another one that was put in there. Now here's the thing with social kinds, is these are things, now here's where the term real gets a little hard. Because when we normally hear the term real, we think, does it exist? And if it exists, then it's real. And she's going to like work this out a little bit. And again, you can critique her. I mean, there's going to be stuff here that doesn't quite make sense for me. So just because you're hearing a philosopher say it, or you hear me say it, this is nothing dogmatic. You can say, well, that doesn't quite make sense to me. Because the goal here is I want to talk a little bit about the different times, the social and the nature. And then I will try to at least show you how Rebecca Mason understood it. And then at the end of this class, I just want to talk about what are the implications for this. I mean, because a lot of this stuff is more applicable than we would initially think, especially in the world that we live. We'll get to that point. All right. So we might say that lithium is something that is not mind dependent, right? I mean, even if we gave it a name, but forget about it. There's no way, I'm not going to go and say this is lithium, and then you're going to go and say, well, no, I think this is lithium. There's got to be something there. So when we're talking about this thing, what is it that we're talking about? We could probably say the same thing about time. Even if we start arguing about exactly how we understand time, we still can pretty much settle on exactly what we would agree time is. Tigers, Teflon, all those things. It can't be, well, that's Teflon for you, but this is Teflon for me. That would not really make sense. But then what do we do with these other things that are, they too are real? This is going to be Mason's point. In other words, is race real? And in what way is it real? Is it real in the same way that lithium is real? And when we call somebody a Republican or a Democrat, what exactly does that mean? I mean, we do this all the time, especially like in politics, right? When somebody's in a particular party, well, they're Democrat. Like, so what? What does that tell me? Is there something essential about that? Is there something that I can say about all Democrats? And if somebody tells you that person's a Democrat, will that then tell me anything meaningful about that particular person? Or they just simply have a party affiliation so they can go and vote in the primaries, and that's about the extent of it. So they just mark down something, because in Pennsylvania, if you're an independent, you've got to wait until the generals, right? That type of thing. Same thing with bourgeoisie. Or we could talk about wealth. We could talk about capitalism. We could talk about poverty. So these are all terms, and these are all kinds of things. You have different causal relations. Like what causes us to understand poverty and in what regards. And if we're going to call the people like, you know what a proletariat and bourgeoisie are? Does anybody know what a proletariat is? Let's do a 5-second political philosophy here.
Like the people, like the proletariat, and then the workers want like the high society.
That's right. So a proletariat is somebody who only has their own labor to sell. That's it. So the bourgeois would have, capital. And capital is not just the money, but it's the means of all the productions. so they can govern things differently, but all you sell is your own labor, and then you pretty much, at least these are the terms that were used through Engels and Marx and such. But anyway, so what do these mean? And who are these people exactly? We're not going to find Republicans, race, and the proletariat in nature in the same way that we're going to find lithium, water, and Teflon, or any of those other things. So then, what meaning do they have for us? Are they not real? Or are they real? And if they are real, are they real only because they exist? And is there something that there's real about them for all of us? Or is it just simply a construct that you and I came up with, and it has no meaning beyond that? Now, it's true that these things might be mind-dependent, right? I mean, a chimpanzee is not going to have any concept of what it means to be a Republican or a Democrat. But I think in the article it said something to the effect that just because these things are mind-dependent, in other words, they may not, okay, so race may not be real in the same way like we would call something biological real. But if we're going to only say things are essential, like it's all they are and nothing more, connected to a biology, I think they're making the point that can't some of this stuff be simply as real even though it's connected to our mind? I mean, the fact that our minds have constructed these things, does that make them something less? Now, something that wasn't, I don't think it was brought up in the article, but when we talk about social kinds and the causal relations they have, we're going to talk in terms of weak and strength, right? Some things are just weaker than others. Like we might say that femininity, depending on where you sit, you know, somebody might say it's a construct, or no, that's something that's very real and essential. But regardless, that would be much stronger, say, than like the notion of being Republican or such. That would be a weaker type of social kind, because that just seems to be lower on the level of identity. It's, even if we were more crass about it, it's still something that you can go in and out of, right? Somebody may think, well, maybe you could change your femininity, but you can't change your femininity in the same way that you would change your political affiliation. I mean, these things are different. So even if we put these all into the category of social kinds, let's at least be aware that, you know, some of them have weaker causes and some of them have stronger ones. Now here's the other thing too. You know, as human beings, we do this necessarily. We put things into groups. We have no other way to distinguish things except by comparing and contrasting. So we build these taxonomies so that we can understand them a little bit. Sometimes it's very useful. I mean, how else would we talk about things in the world if we can't put them into certain categories? But then other times we can overemphasize those categories and make those things as though they're so rigid that you can't move between them, or that they're so essential that we know something about the person because they're in that category. This is an old joke. Let me see if you get it. And if you get it, I'm not saying if you have it, just so you understand, I don't find it funny. Somebody was complaining about, you know, I don't like, you know, anything that divides people from each other. And there's really, you know, only two kinds of people in the world. Those who put people in groups and those that don't. Come on, do you get it? They just put somebody in two groups and you just divided somebody. It's almost like you can't help this, right? So even like, and I'm not teasing anybody, somebody says, well, I don't belong to any denomination, I'm non-denominational. Well, doesn't that sort of become its own denomination? You may not have a strong affiliation. So all these things then become ways that we just categorize. So social kinds are very important for us. I mean, how else do we communicate with each other? And how do we just say we know something if we don't have a way to put them into categories, and then those categories have some sort of meaning? And to be honest, things like batteries and tigers and, you know, you name it, might be natural kinds, and they might be sure ways for us to categorize stuff, but those aren't the biggest things in our lives, are they? I mean, things that affect us most aren't, you know, whether or not that is or is not Teflon, or whether or not that is or is not a tiger. You know, the things that affect us most in our lives are these social kinds. So understanding some of the epistemology behind them and the ontology, the what is it, these are not half bad arguments to have. It gets very difficult sometimes to have arguments, especially if people get heated about their positions on these, but that being said, it's still important. So anyway, the point with social and natural kinds together is that we're going to try to ascribe some properties to them, right? And within those properties, then, we're going to talk about how does this affect our social relations. So we can talk about whether or not race is biological. Probably not. But we can talk about what exactly race is. And calling it a social construct doesn't really help us that much because, well, what does that mean? Is it real? Well, yes. Well, in what way is it real? It's not real in the same way biology is real. Okay, but does something have to be biological to be real? And then it goes back to the idea that, hey, just because, it's something essential is tied into biology, if this is tied to our mind, that can be very real too. And if somebody, like in another course I was teaching, we were talking about how, this one feminist philosopher was talking about race as, you couldn't call it fiction, because if you called it fiction, therefore then racism itself would not be something except itself to be fictitious. Now a lot of the students liked that argument. I thought I let it go because I tried to be dogmatic, but I didn't like it whatsoever. First of all, I didn't like the term fiction. It would have been nicer if they would have talked about it in terms of social kind and construct. Because something can be a social construct and still be very important to us. But it doesn't have to be essential. So even if we don't have something biological to say what race is, I don't think anybody's going to argue that we can't identify certain people within categories. That could still be helpful, right? Depending on what we're talking about. Nonetheless. So we're going to ask too, again, to what extent does these things have value because they are mind dependent? So when remember, when somebody says something is like it's constructed by the mind, it's a social construct, some people might hear that as we made it up. And I don't think that's a fair way to think about something. How would you understand if somebody said to you, well, this is simply a social construct? How important do you think that would be, or how would you go about trying to determine what value that has in your social relations? What do you think? What might be some social constructs? You think human's a social construct? Or do you think human's more natural? I think if we're going to call the tiger natural, I think we can call it human natural. But what about this? What about if they got AI to the point? Sometimes you see some of these videos of these life-like, robots. It's kind of creepy, isn't it? What if we got a robot that was so dang close? Would that make us less human? Would it make the robot more human? Would we then have to determine that if we're going to attribute human attributes to this, are we just passing along things we think, or are we totally a construct with this?
Would gym be a social construct?
Well, it's certainly the way the practices are, the rituals. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. You get into a little, if it's a revealed religion, you get into a little problem because it's outside of the realm of something like this. But yes, a lot of things about cultures would be constructs. Types of food, ethnicities, ethnicities aren't, see, here's a situation where you have a construct, but it's meaningful. If somebody says, well, I was born and raised in Puerto Rico and that's my ethnicity, it's not necessarily a construct, but there is a lot of things that are constructed about that particular ethnicity. But it doesn't mean it's simply because it's a construct and it's mind dependent, but it doesn't have meaning. And we're not going to say it's not real. But yet we might have a hard time saying what it is. Here's the thing. Oh, go ahead.
You said that humans are natural kinds. Can't we say that social construct, the sort of determined identity?
Well, that's another issue, right? See, once these things take on identities, they can almost become ideological, right? So we're going to see that, if I'm understanding you correctly. Is that what you mean?
And a human, you define humans by their race, their political party, what you have listed as social kinds. That's how you identify natural kinds. They also be social kinds.
Well, they could have good social import, probably, I would imagine, or maybe parts of that could be, right? There might be certain things that the humanness that are so essential that they are natural, but then there might be other aspects that we've attributed for a long time, not so much. maybe aspects of like affection and such. You know, we would have to determine exactly how essential is that to the human person, because we see affection between, you know, chimpanzees and orangutans if they're young. So we might say, well, okay, so if we associate with that with us, that's part of a construct. This is the problem. It gets very difficult to determine what's essential and what's not, right? So we didn't really talk about it in this class. I might have mentioned it before, but you know, there's different definitions of what a definition is. I know it sounds silly, right? But usually, like one of the older types of definition was when you take some like, you know, general, like we'd say a rational animal. So if we belong to the animal kingdom, yet we're rational. I know that's very simplistic, but you're looking for something that fits the overall, and then you're looking for something specific that makes it different than all other things. And then that is the closer you can get to making something more distinct, then the closer you're getting probably to the defining it. And the definition really is the essence, right? So that's what you're trying to aim at. So we would have, and this, again, I've read so many articles on this in the last few weeks, I forget which one, but they were talking about looking when certain species would interbreed. What does this mean? I mean, do we now have, you know, a third? Or do we just have one that has characteristics of two? How do you determine this?
I think in some way, categorization helps to differentiate things of nuance, like differences.
We'd be paralyzed if we couldn't. I mean, could you
Otherwise-
imagine if your only answer was being, and hey, you went to the zoo, what'd you see? Beings. You have to be able to say something, right? Okay, but now there's other ways to do it that could be a social construct. Like if you would say you went to like, okay, they have one of those little rooms where it's all the black lights, everything, you went in there. What did you see? I saw insects. Okay, that's probably a natural kind. But if you told me I just saw bugs, now it's not just a vague term, we're probably talking more of a construct. We're not quite sure it all fits within that category and such like that. My point through all of this is that this isn't just like, you know, language games. And there's a lot of like social impact that this has on our lives. Again, most of the things that affect us as human beings are going to probably fall, at least we're going to determine what falls into which of these, but a lot of our social relations are going to be based on these categorizations that we form. And we need to kind of understand, like, what do we mean? Because people use terms all the time. Again, is it real? What do you mean by real? What does it exist? Is that it? If it exists, then it's real? And what about natural? What does that mean? That it only exists if you find it in nature? Like people say, I don't eat things that are natural. Well, enjoy your lead biscuits. I mean, no, lead's natural, you know? So we have to get, is the more specific that we can get, not only is it our language clearer, but we're starting to at least, you know, categorize things more specifically.
So would social be more categories then?
Well, see, that's part of, it depends on, if you talk about a stronger and weaker spectrum, down at the weaker side, it would be an opinion. I would like to think that, you know, there's aspects to, like, say, femininity that aren't purely opinion. Because then, how would we have a discussion about it? Well, we'll talk towards the end of this about femininity, and I'll talk about 3 feminists. And they're all going to have different, you know, opinions, but they're substantiated. They don't just say, here's what I think. They say, here's what I think, and it's based on certain criteria that they put forth, right? So a lot of this, it does come down to the argument. There's no doubt of that, but if it was only at the level of opinion, then we couldn't really say, like, what an apple is. You know, well, if I'm not calling this an apple, you're not calling this apple, how are we going to communicate, right? So anyway, so when we're talking about something and categorizing it, whatever that is, X, you know, X is to be X if it's regarded as X. I know it sounds rather simple and maybe even a little bit silly. But a social construct is going to almost say that we have come to some sort of, you know, terminal agreement that this is what we will call this. And we are going to do that the best we can by determining what is essential about that. Like if I took, by essential, if I took this or that away, would it not be that anymore? If we took, you know, the entire texture of an apple away, would it no longer be an apple? my newest grandson eats some sort of mixture of kale, asparagus, I don't know, it looks nasty. He loves it, you know. It has nothing there to, I mean, outside of the smell, there's nothing there that really resembles even a food product, right? A little bit different. I mean, we understand that this is something pureed and such, but we identify many things with our senses, right? By the shapes, the scents, the smell, the textures, the flavors, all that kind of thing. So anyway, whatever it is, we take something away that's essential, we're going to say it's no longer that. And then we're going to have to almost just agree that what we mean by real, at least for this discussion, isn't simply that it exists, but that it has value. In other words, if we're going to say that there's something to femininity and masculinity, those are real things. They're not just real things that they exist, and they can be constructs. They're not entirely, they might be mind dependent, but they're not entirely opinion based either. If somebody's going to say, here's what I think masculinity is, you need to have an argument for it.
Wouldn't, like, so you said that, like, if you took something away from X, we wouldn't know if it's still X. But wouldn't, like, the whole thing with the wax, wouldn't that, like,
When they
the
melted the
opposite of
wax.
this?
Well,
Because you still know that it's.
but remember, that was their argument, that's why you can't trust the senses.
Yeah,
You
but
know.
I'm saying, like, this is saying that, like, if it's different, then it's not going to be.
Yeah, I guess maybe that'd be interesting to see how that argument would work with this. I mean, that argument, you know, it gets a little tough to make, like in a more, how do you want to say, technological advanced state. But the illustration is still very good. In other words, I wouldn't move that too far beyond their illustration that our senses are telling us by smell, sight, pinging the wax. This is what it does when we melt it. We no longer get that. You know, so the point is, how far can I trust my senses? But we can still rationalize. Remember, even talking about, like, remember, like Hume said, you know, we might have these ideas, but our imagination is unlimited. So I can probably, in my imagination, I can take a candle and rearrange that candle into the melted wax, and I'd understand that. We might have to argue with Hume that I have to experience it to know that's true. Okay, fine, you know. But I think maybe if you were explaining to somebody, if somebody had, again, this is Hume, you'd have to understand what it means to melt something. You'd have to understand what the properties of wax are. And even if somebody never saw a candle melt, if they saw plastic melt, they'd be able to understand, okay, well then it melts like that. But that's still good though, you thought of that.
You still experience with melting though.
Yes. Yeah, you
Like,
can't
it
get,
has to be an experience.
you can't get away from that. You know, you're right. In that regard. What's that? You draw from previous experiences. Yeah. Okay. So now what Rebecca Mason, she came up with 3 arguments. Her first one is that she just says, look, it's just flawed. You know. Oh, by the way, I should probably at least mention this. When you talk about ontology, we're talking about like universals again. Where do these things come from, right? Because remember, like with Plato, the universals were outside the cave, and they were perfect, and they were always there. And then we recollected them. With Aristotle, they were only present in some particular, but it was the universal that made all the things like the other thing. Did we talk at all about nominalism here? I don't want to reference it too much. Okay, all nominalism is that, again, a real nutshell, that there are no universals whatsoever. It's just categories. That's all it is, right? So a lot of the modern world is kind of based off of that. So when you start to think that once you get beyond, like, you know, the chemical elements and everything, and some things that we can actually call natural kinds, and you go into the social constructs, if you don't see any universals present in those things, and then it isn't so much that it could just be whatever you want it to be, but it could change. And it's not something that's fixed, because the universal is fixed and never changes. So we live in what we would call a nominalistic, you know, society, where we ascribe the nature to the thing. We will say what it is, even if we do this collectively, okay? It's really not something I wanted to say on the side. But anyway, here's the thing. When you're in the social sciences, and I think, and you can't I hate talking so broad. But I think there's a certain undercurrent with some sociologists that they don't feel legitimate. You know, in other words, we're the soft science. You know, we make the arguments we really can't prove it like they can in chemistry. So they're always looking for something there. I think it's a false sense of need. When I was in college and I remember in my psychology class, my behavioral statistics, this guy was so anal about calling what we were doing an absolute empirical science. I didn't agree with it at all, but it didn't bother me. But it bothered him. You know, he felt if he didn't have a flat-out empirical science, then therefore what he was doing wasn't legitimate. I didn't think that was a good question to ask. I thought there's no way in heck that psychology is empirical like that, but who cares? That was my impression. But you couldn't say that in the classroom because this guy would have shouted you down. My wife had the same experience. I was in a PhD cohort a few weeks ago, and one of the guys was critiquing someone, and he has his degree from the University of Chicago in sociology, is his graduate degree, and he goes, well, my complaint is that what you're doing is not falsifiable. And I was always taught in sociology that you cannot ascribe to it as true unless it's falsifiable. That's hard science talk. Well, the other guy threw it right back at him. And he just said, I don't really care if it's falsifiable. I make the argument for it. You know, I wonder, and I'm not trying to read into, you know, Rebecca here, but I'm wondering if some of this concern isn't that I need to legitimize certain things. So don't take that as, you know, gospel truth, because I don't know her writings that well. But when you start to say there's a flawed distinction between the two, in the back of my mind, some antennas going up saying you want to sneak some, you know, more social categories. In other words, I think rather than sneaking some social kinds into the natural kinds, I think what they're trying to do is grab what identifies as natural kinds and bring it down to the social sciences, so that it makes it seem more legitimate. So that we can talk about certain things that are social kinds in the same way we can talk about lithium. Now, see, for me, that's not important. You know, to be full disclosure, that's not important to me. I never thought that was good. The empirical sciences are, again, I've said it 100 times. It's wonderful doing a pharmaceutical test, but it's never going to talk to me about some of the things that are most important in my life, and those things are as legitimate to me as what Teflon is, right? So I don't have that sort of like prejudice going in. But I think sometimes some people do. And I just wonder in the back of my head if this is what she's talking about here. So, in other words, poverty in women, I think the point's still valid. That when we use terms like poverty in women, okay, we can still find something meaningful to say about these things as categories. Even if we have a floating definition, particularly on poverty, we still can, you know, say something meaningful. So if that's all that's meant by, you know, the empirical undercurrent of it, then I'm fine with it. I just don't have the idea to push it any farther than that. Now, she also says that if we're going to try to say that certain things like lithium and tigers and Teflon have an essence, in other words, we can say exactly what they are essentially. Here's what it is. You know, this is the essence of Teflon. We can show you what it means. She's trying to make the point that she doesn't think it's controversial to also say that social kinds have essences. Now, what do you think about that? Think in terms of universals and social kinds. What do you think might be an issue there? And it's okay if we're reading into what she's thinking or what. This is all part of the discussion. Like, what would be the essence of poverty? What do you think?
Not having money.
Yeah, not having money. Now, money would be a construct, right? Did anybody read about what she said about money? I think it was in this article.
Yeah.
Who had it? It was, you know, in other words, I think she used leaves, talking about leaves. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She said that like they make it, like it's not like part of it.
That's right. So, but see, here's where I got a little confused in what exactly she was trying to get at, because, you know, those things are the signals of exchange. You know, who cares if we're gonna call money colored rocks, or if we're gonna call it printed paper?
Yeah.
But what money is,
It's the currency, it's like, money exists like for price, but they like exchange, like, I don't know, give you some meat, give me some fur, something.
Like
It's still
actual
money.
value.
yeah, even if it's a barter, right? Like I'll give you a bag of potatoes and you give me, some peppers.
But now we just assign value to like something that's really valuable.
So if we were, see down there, it gets a little iffy. Like, what do you do with it? Like, let's just for the sake of the argument, let's call it bartering, right? Because that seems, that, at least on the surface to me, to be something of a natural kind. I don't know that had to be, or do you think that had to be constructed?
Yeah, people like have different values. My values are
They will assign different values, and that would be totally constructed. But the fact that they think that something has to be exchanged for that value. Now, it doesn't have to be like a physical thing, right? Somebody might say, like, look, I'm elderly, you come and visit me, you spend so much time with me, you're such good company, here, I'd like to make you this. Oh, no, that kind of thing. Now, technically that's a barter, but there's not really anything there. But if we were to talk about the essence of the currency that happened between those two, we would still call that an exchange. We might not say that it was like an agreed upon contract, fine, but nonetheless, there seemed to be something, and who knows, maybe the lady just said, you don't know what it means for me just to come here and hug me and spend, 20 minutes when you drop off the mail. Like my mom, she would buy Christmas cards for like the newspaper girl and everything, come on in, that kind of thing. I got some cookies, this type of stuff. Those are meanings. So I don't know, what do you think? I mean, like, would we call any type of exchange or barter system, would you think we call it a natural or a social kind? There's no answer to this. I don't have it. My gut feeling wants to call it a natural kind. We might just call like the different ways we assign values a social construct. So, but see, I'm not sure what she would think on that, because well,
Be like a social thing, because
yes.
if we're talking about like gold, like, you could say that gold is not valuable for you, but then like it costs a lot of money.
So if we were talking about like does gold as a currency have an essence? Probably, I don't know what I would say. I would say no. She probably would say yes. I think it's where she's trying to go with this. See, this is where I got the impression that she was trying to elevate social kinds to make them as similar as she can to natural kinds. And again, I might be reading in this because I have a prejudice. I have a prejudice about people who try to make the social sciences legitimate by making them pure empirical. That's never been a problem with me. But I know enough people who that bothers them, that somehow they don't feel like they're doing something real, I don't know. I could be reading into this. I don't know. Anyway, so we could talk about, is there an essence to race? That would be tough. What would it be? Now, she's already said that it's not biological, but she's also made the point that it doesn't have to be biological for it to be real. Because she said mind-dependent things rely on the mind as much as, biological things depend on life. So if biological things depend on life, like if being a human is something essential, that depends on life. If we give it a social construct that's mind-dependent, well, that depends on our mind. So her point is, why is that any less real? So I don't know. But we might be able to say what race is, but that's going to be a construct for sure. Does it have an essence? It depends on what you mean by essence. Is the essence placed there by us? In other words, is it what we've agreed upon? Is it a contract? I know I'm not talking like something silly, but maybe as a people we've agreed to this, or maybe not. Same thing with money, right? We've already talked about that. So if we're going to say that they have an essence, I think it's legitimate to say what type of essence it is, and I think she's saying that too.
Like,
So
it needs to have an essence for it to exist.
it has to have something.
If it exists, we are sure that race exists, and not like a negative way.
Yes.
Like someone, like I'm different from someone, I don't know, like a European person is different from a person who was born in the States.
Sure.
And like, it's like, there's an essence to it, it's gonna be real.
There's something there. Okay. Good enough. I mean, a lot of this stuff, again, it's the type of argument you make. Her third thing is, just because they're mind dependent, doesn't just because of that mean that they're not real. So this is where we would have an issue, and this is what I was saying about that last article that I did with another course, where the lady was saying, I don't like the fact that somebody's calling race a fiction, because then racism isn't real. And I didn't like that argument at all. And I thought, well, but race can still be a social construct, and it doesn't much matter if race is biological or not. People's reaction to what they perceive as race is certainly real. I didn't get the argument, but that was a different article. So here, if we're going to say that, there was something natural or whatever about poverty or women, they are mind dependent in the sense that would poverty exist without any rational being thinking about that? Probably not. But that doesn't mean it's not real. That's why we have to make sure that when we're talking, we don't connect real to things that exist. We're going to get the language goofed up here. So, in the end, let me put it this way. I'm more interested in this. So when we had this discussion on Friday about the Kentucky Republicans, conservatives, and the New England liberals, you have a difficult thing from the get-go. Just because you identify somebody with that social kind, political affiliation, what is the essence of that? And is that a real thing? And what makes somebody not Republican or not Democrat? Is it just the fact that they have not registered that way? An independent who has liberal leanings be technically a Democrat? And how do we, this is what I mean, how these are the categories that really affect our lives. And we have a hard time talking about these things because we tend to think they're monolithic, right? I mean, the minute somebody tells you that they're a Democrat, all these things go through your head because of what we associate as the essence of those things. And we may or may not be entirely correct. You might be sort of correct. And we know it's a social construct. We know it's not a natural time. But if we're going to ask questions like Mason did, well, then what would be the essence of that? That's going to be a little difficult to hit. Same thing with male or female, socioeconomic class. Like, you're in a women's study class. Okay, so, I'm thinking of like 3 different feminists. My mind went totally blank. I'm sure I wrote down the name somewhere. Christina Hoff Sommers. Did you talk about her at all? Did they talk about her at all? Okay, if they did, they may or may not have liked her much. Christina Hoff Sommers, here's an interesting, way to talk about all of this. She's a 1970s, almost like Gloria Steinem age feminist, but she's what you would call like an equity feminist, right? She just wants to see, it's level overall. She has a lot of issues with how she thinks modern feminism is tearing down masculinity. She doesn't like that, okay? She's written a book like, something like Who Hijacked Feminism. Then you go to like a Gloria Steinem. Did you talk about her at all? Okay. Gloria Steinem is more of a radical feminist. Probably wouldn't agree with a lot that, the other feminist thinks, but she's I'm trying to think of how, I want to explain it. I know I made some notes because I didn't want to, you ever hear of Miss Magazine? MS Magazine? Okay, she was the editor of that. She's hypercritical of like women's studies degrees in college. Not a big fan of it. Which would put her as with another feminist, Judith Butler. Did you study her? Okay, wow. I could just be old and way off, right? So Judith Butler is more like a deconstructionist. You know what? Did you ever hear that term before, deconstruction? Okay. So deconstruction would like deny, and this is very vague, I know, it's very general, would deny like this, like with those foundationalism, that we couldn't build on things before, get rid of it. It denies essentialism, that there is an essence to anything. Okay, so it's almost like total construct. So Judith Butler and any deconstruction feminist would look at female and femininity and say, nothing to do with each other. You know, totally two different things. And if they become a construct, like if you like, okay, typically like you would have like say Hoff and maybe even Steinem. Steinem would understand what, well, Judith Butler would understand what like corporal anatomy is for a male and female. They're not arguing that. They would just argue that those things are subjective categories that we're constructing and have no real meaning in themselves. So once you've mixed gender and sex, if you're going to call the gender a construct, you're going to move in and say, well, we can, outside of the bodily autonomy, we can construct what that is too, male or female. So when you hear terms like feminism, you know, right off the bat, we start thinking, you know, okay, is this a natural con? If it is, what would be the essence of feminism? If it's a construct, even then, what are we talking about? Because it's nothing monolithic. So if somebody says, I'm a feminist, that starts the conversation, doesn't end it. And in fact, you might be there for the next 2 hours trying to figure out exactly what does this exactly mean. So these become categories that are useful for us to have conversations, but we have a hard time getting to the base of it. So there, if we had 3 feminists in this room right now, they would all be debating each other on exactly what exactly feminism is. And that doesn't, you know, you don't take that then and say, well, then they're all wrong, or there is nothing there. It could be that they're all right, or one of them is right, and the other 2 are wrong. It's hard to say. But if just because these things are, you know, but nonetheless, who would argue that feminism isn't something real? It's a real thing. We're going to struggle, though, to get to, like, on number 2, what type of essence is this? What do we ascribe to that? Is it tied into a hormone? Somebody might say, like I had a student 2 semesters ago that said outside of the anatomy, there's no distinction between male and female. And I said, well, even like the chemicals, like so estrogen, testosterone, they have no effect. She said, not really. I said, well, then why does somebody, I'm not bullying anybody. I said, well, then why would somebody who's transitioning have to take one of those? And not just once, but perpetually, right, type of thing. It's just something, these are the things to think about. So what we're doing in this class, you know, about, you know, what is reality and how do we understand the metaphysics of something, and by metaphysics, what is it? It's pretty relevant. You may not like, you know, it may be hard to get to the answers. And if it muddles your thinking, like if you think, I'm more confused about this now than when we started, well, again, that's what the cave is in there. You know, it's like, that's the beginning of, not education overall, but education in this particular little subject area. It's like we've got to iron this stuff out. What we see, and this is what I want to do on Friday, is people don't iron this stuff out. They just go right to what they assert. You know, here's what I think. And they start talking, and then you start talking, and next thing you know, you're getting names jabbed back and forth, but you don't know how to have a conversation. We haven't really gotten back to what we're talking about. Does any of that make sense? Capiche? That's enough? All right.